leader, Hugh Taft-Morales. The talk is entitled Pride and Shame, the Ups and Downs of Sexual Identity. Please welcome Hugh.
Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning.
Good morning. Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
So in 2010, I was certified as an ethical culture leader at the American Ethical Union Assembly in Scranton, Pennsylvania, home of the office. I contributed about 100 hours to a 4-part program for that assembly, which included, I call the whole program, Inner Worth and Outer Pride. Ethical culturists attended a presentation at the University of Scranton called LGBTQ Grassroots and Internet Activism. Then there was a reception at a bookstore and a photo exhibit by Liz Brasberry, her installation called 400 Same-Sex Couples Facing Inequality. Then we moved to a church, St. Luke's, where we had a panel discussion about promoting marriage equality. And then we concluded the evening with the event that gave me the greatest joy. I don't know if anybody was there. About 40 of us attended a drag show at the 12th Penny Saloon. If you were there, raise your hand. Nobody was there. Boy, that was some time ago. Yeah. This concluding event gave me a great deal of joy, partially because my work was done, the evening had been a success, the ethical culturists were letting their hair down and singing along with the drag performers. But the main reason it gave me such joy was because the performers on stage reveled in and shared their joy for their whole being. And it struck me that these young men, and they were men, many of them gay, but not all, but all publicly challenging the norms of sexual identity and expression, they took a risk in northeast Pennsylvania, which is not necessarily the friendliest place for non-normative sexuality. Now, each person was unique, they each had their own story, but I saw in all of them this celebration of who they were, including their sexuality, that was grounded in courage, reinforced by community, and fueled by joy. Now, I thought how different my story was. Here I am, a cisgendered, heterosexual, monogamous male, raised in a sexually repressed WASP New England. And though I enjoyed privilege growing up of fitting in, because I was one of the categories that fit in society easily, I was much less able to express my own pride about sexuality. In much of the first half of my life, I felt awkward about it. Uncertainty and fear interfered with a healthy embrace of my sexual identity and orientation and expression, which are all different, by the way, and we'll have to catch up on some things. But I thought to myself, how was it possible that these drag queens on stage were reveling so joyously in who they were? And while I didn't necessarily want to start a career of drag performance, I was jealous. I was jealous of that joy. And that got me thinking about how sexuality is so wrapped up in cultural dysfunction in America. And while people care about and share about their sexuality at different levels, sexuality is a primal part of our existence. And while thanks to medical science and birth control, it's not necessarily related to reproduction, there is an element that touches on that, and that should be celebrated. Certainly, while it can sometimes be difficult or painful, it's something that can give great pleasure in life, and that should be celebrated. And why don't we celebrate this part of our marvelous machine that we are, that could give us so much joy? Why don't we shape it better so it's a source for goodness in everybody's life? I'm not going to answer all those questions today, and my relatively reserved personality will keep me from getting overly explicit, for those of you who are comfortable with that. I'm still learning the complexities of sexuality, how identity and orientation and presentation and performance both overlap and are independent. I also am going to be speaking primarily as a non-expert and from a male point of view because I'm talking about my own experience. And I'm going to try to address 4 themes: shame, violence, silence, and joy. Shame, violence, silence, and joy, and how shame is involved in all of that. And I hope these words help us individually and collectively bring out our best in all our different manifestations. So let me start with shame. I'm not speaking about feeling ashamed for things that we do, which is a common thing in all of our lives. I'm talking about chronic shame or toxic shame, shame that intrudes suddenly and intensely in our lives. And it can hit us quickly, like when we're caught doing something that somehow is inappropriate, as mundane as picking one's nose. Right? If you've seen the Seinfeld episode where Jerry is caught, or he claims he's not because he just touched his nose. But it can come on quickly, and it can really hit us hard. Michael Aaron, a certified sex therapist who holds a PhD in clinical sexology, writes that shame is a, quote, core emotion because it wreaks so much havoc on all aspects of our lives, but particularly on our sexuality. It's made a lot worse because American culture is heavily influenced by Calvinist attitudes of the body. Christian frameworks praise the perfect, pristine, divine, uncorrupted by bodily functions, and condemn the world of the flesh that corrupt the soul and lead us to sin. This old story we've heard so often. Many of you have talked about it, and about how we carry a guilty conscience. And sometimes we feel like we're children being caught touching ourselves, having to suffer through the confessional booth or a therapist's office because we somehow were involved in this sin of touching ourselves. But in some ways, I think that shame about our sexual identity is even more toxic than guilt. We compare them. Darlene Lancer, family therapist, explains that shame can be very nefarious, as it is one of these emotions that can become internalized as a part of our identity. Guilt is an emotion that we experience when we feel bad about something we did. Shame, in contrast, is emotion that is experienced as feeling bad about who we are. An interesting distinction she makes. Shame can cut very much to our core, and it's harder to identify and externalize and deconstruct. I think women can be particularly vulnerable given the patriarchy and misogyny in our culture. Lancer talks about shame being reinforced publicly through social customs, whether that's scantily clad women advertising products or people being forced to wear burqas. Both men and women, though, do suffer from this. Lancer writes, both men and women are largely unaware of the damaging impact on men that a culture of male dominance can cause. It can cause shame to both men and women. Sexuality brings abundant opportunities to exaggerate both our vulnerability and shame, to feel pleasure and close, but also to feel unworthy, unacceptable, and unlovable. End quote. Lancer goes on to critique what she calls toxic masculinity or hypermasculinity, which is somehow boys are conditioned into this often, where physical strength and toughness and aggression are promoted. Traditional feminine traits are often downplayed, like tenderness or compassion or empathy, and they lead to the pejorative labels of sissy or mama's boy, things like that. I mean, these are classic tropes in our society. And hyper-masculine men often reenact the same trauma that they got when they were kids. Lancer says, quote, this is how shame gets passed down. Now, while older males in my family were not hypermasculine, they did stumble over tenderness and emotions. And despite my deep love for my children, I know that there were times where I did not always nurture their sexuality as well as I wish I had. At one time or another, I think the shame that I felt growing up, I passed on to them. Now, my parents were not raised to have healthy attitudes about sexuality or to deal with it with their children. I wasn't taught to see pleasure, particularly erotic pleasure, as good or even normal. And this isn't unusual. Donald Nathanson, the psychiatrist, explains that shame is experienced by infants only a few weeks old and continue to operate throughout our lives as a script. He talks about when pleasurable activities are interrupted for an infant, they will often have the same reactions that adults have when they get shamed. They bow their heads, they lower their eyes, they look downwards, they blush. So these same physical reactions seem to indicate to him that it is deeply hardwired. When I have felt shame, especially regarding sexuality, it was infantilizing. It took me right back to feeling these feelings of being vulnerable or judged or exposed or awkward about it. And I think this is the case for many, well, particularly middle school boys at dances where they have to go dance with somebody they love, or in gym class was a particularly difficult time where sexuality. My gym teacher would tell us we had to shower after class. I think it was linked to the hygiene course he was teaching us as well. But nothing struck fear in a 12-year-old more than being told by an adult to go shower in a shower room with 8 spigots and no dividers, no privacy. And those boys who were brave enough or stupid enough to go do it were criticized and mocked. Even though everybody was supposedly privileged people in this certain environment, they were the targets for jokes. I remember middle school dances, which is always awkward when you're dancing with somebody you're attracted to and they realize that before you realize it. and boys can giggle over words of sexual anatomy, but when they are criticized about their anatomy, their shape, or their size, or anything like that, they're deeply, deeply embarrassed and shamed. And this is throughout our culture. I just watched a Netflix comedy special with Ray Romano, who I really enjoy his humor. But my wife and I were struck about how he mentioned more than once being caught masturbating. And he said that he confessed that it led him to have to kill the observer, whether that was a spider in his shower or his dog. So, although it's a joke, it underscores just how embarrassed some men can be about their own bodies, certainly in my family. So this brings me to the second of my themes, which is violence, shame's association with it. And I have a theory. I think that violence, both physical violence and emotional violence, towards oneself and towards others, is somehow linked to shame quite often. I mean, I think sometimes shame generally can be involved in this sort of psychic violence towards yourself through a myriad of symptoms. Shame can harm one's sex life. It can lead to problems related to sexual performance or the ability to give or receive pleasure. Anxiety can lead people to separate love from sex, and this in turn can generate fear of intimacy, and the problems just spiral out of control, and it can lead to even self-destructive behavior. This violence can become risk-taking or the development of unhealthy lifestyles. Therapist Robert Weiss wrote that, quote, "It's no great secret that most alcoholics, drug addicts, and behavioral addicts live with deeply felt feelings of shame. In fact, shame is nearly always a part of the underlying matrix of psychological conditions that can typically lead to addiction." And I think sexual shame, shame about sexuality in all of its forms, can be even more destructive. And I know it's linked to the suicides of many LGBTQ kids who don't feel like they fit in. Some men fall into what's called counterphobic behavior, which is described by a therapist as a way to deal with fear and shame by immersing yourself in that. It's a bit of the if you can't beat it, join it reaction, where you embrace what confronts you and then you get a sense of control, and the end result can even be more suffering, but you do it anyway. As an example, to explain what I mean, is I've read a little bit about how exhibitionists, people who expose themselves, are usually the most fearful of being exposed, of having their bodies seen and critiqued by other people. One writer put it, they attempt to project their shame onto others by trying to intimidate the same people they blame for their feelings of inadequacy, women. So in the case of flashers, inadequacy is masked by a sense of power at creating shock or disgust in those they flash. Now, obviously worse is violence that's directly outward towards others in physical ways, and hypermasculinity and toxic machismo can lead to that. It's used to wrap around insecurities, but then it can spill out into actual violence. I found this fascinating. James Gilligan, who is the husband of Carol Gilligan, author of In a Different Voice, has worked for 25 years with the American prison system studying the motivation and causes of violent behavior, and he concluded that shame was, quote, necessary and maybe sufficient for violence. The most dangerous men on earth are those who are afraid they are wimps. Now, Darlene Lancer says that the shaming of the body can lead boys to mask their insecurity with aggressive, disrespectful, and abusive behavior towards women that become violent. And this is worldwide. One sociologist, Jennifer Gonzalez, explained in a recent TED Talk that most cultures teach very narrow definitions of what sexuality is, and that often disempowers men and women, but particularly women, and can teach women to be subservient. So when women are not empowered, they more easily can become victims. And I cannot do justice today to the horrific violence towards women all around the world that comes through violent cultural attitudes and contributes to domestic abuse and sex trafficking and rape. But those who step outside of even those traditional norms of man and woman are even more vulnerable. Transgender people experience direct and systemic violence at alarmingly high rates. They're 4 times more likely to live in poverty, twice as likely to be unemployed, they're discriminated against at work, they're harassed by police. They're murdered, they're homeless, they're incarcerated. But we still stay silent about it because we're confused. So let me talk about silence a little bit. Why are we so silent about sexuality towards ourselves, towards others? Why don't we deal with it proactively and more effectively? It's like we were waiting for violence to end up killing somebody before we act. But that is the power of shame. Brené Brown puts it this way: shame derives its power from being unspeakable. So we stay silent. I mean, look how we handle sex in film, for example, and on television. Film ratings warn mainly about the nakedness and cuss words, but not the murders and mutilations. And again, it's due to, I believe, remnants of our Calvinist culture that says suffering is okay, but sexual pleasure isn't. It's a bizarre flip. Back in the 1920s, the Catholic Church propelled the National Legion of Decency into the role of a national censor. And they were the first ones pushing censorship of films to make sure that the silver screen would have no prurient interests displayed. And even in medicine, where you think you could be honest, this nation has been intensely prudish. Mary Roach, who I recommend highly to you, wrote about this in her book called Bonk, B-O-N-K, The Curious Coupling of Sex and Science. Fascinating book. She talks about how a gynecologist named James Platt White was kicked out of the American Medical Association in 1851 for letting medical students watch a live birth. Gynecology students. In 1975, Emo Nogra, the gynecologist, was booed off a medical stage giving a lecture because he talked about venereal disease. And even the sexual liberation movement of the 60s couldn't change things all that much. In 1970, a sex researcher, Vern Bulla, was placed on the FBI's most dangerous Americans list for his, quote, subversive activities in his professional research. So today, it's not surprising that those who study sexuality actually report back that when they tell people that they're researching sex and sexology, that people think they have this weird desire to be sexually excited at work all the time. Like you have to have some prurient interest to go into that field. Now, pornography and prostitution are riddled with abuse and manipulation, and there are, however, actors and sex workers who choose these professions. Now, I want to be clear. Many, many women are forced into using their bodies to make a profit or to feed their children because they have no other choice. That's huge. But there are women who choose freely to go into pornography or prostitution, but they're looked down upon in our culture. Male athletes who endanger their bodies, suffer concussions, are rewarded with money and fame. So we really have a problem with how we deal honestly with how we use our bodies. There's no wonder that many of the young men that I taught in my 25 years of teaching high school talked about their sexual activity and bragged about it, but when I asked if they talked to their partner about sex before having sex, they looked at me as if I was crazy. So they could have sex, but they couldn't talk about it. Now, I'm deeply thankful that things are changing. My children were the beneficiaries of Our Whole Lives, which is a Unitarian Universalist program on encouraging healthy dialogue about sex and sexuality. And we're getting better at it, but there's still a lot of silence, especially about how kids often learn about sex, which is through pornography. Given the high level of misogyny and violence in pornography, it seems to me that as adults we want to talk about it more, not less, but we're too embarrassed to do that. So sometimes the younger kids are teaching the adults. There's a program that Maggie Jones of the New York Times wrote about called Pornography Literacy Curriculum that's used in a Boston peer leadership group. And it helps adolescents apply critical thinking skills to decoding messages in pornography and separating myth from reality and the unhealthy from the healthy. More than 300 schools in New Zealand and Australia have a program called In the Picture, which incorporates statistics and studies and exercises about sexuality for teens. And the proponents say that they're taking on the ugly aspects of pornography while trying to remain sex positive. That, I think, is our task. A local teacher here, Albertino, wrote a book called For Goodness Sex, changing the way we talk to teens about sexuality. And he stresses that more comprehensive education is needed to help kids relate to each other sexually with respect. He says it requires relationship skills, and pornography doesn't teach that. A few years ago, right here, Jill McDevitt, a sexologist from Westchester, came and spoke. And she talked about the fact that when she has opened up a sex shop in Westchester, right on Main Street, that was all bright and cheery, she got a lot of pushback because people thought this was somehow unhealthy. And yet she was just trying to teach people to talk about it in healthy ways and to celebrate their sexuality so that we have happier relationships and we're happier with ourselves. So it brings me back around to this idea of joy that I think is so underappreciated, certainly in certain areas of my life, my family, New England British attitudes. Joy and pride. More and more people are celebrating sexuality today, whether it's in public performances or in parades like we go on here. And that's fantastic, because people are more comfortable with who they are and how they love their bodies and how they love other bodies. But we've got a long way to go. Younger people, I think, are helping us. Many of them identify being outside traditional gender roles and identities and orientations and expressions. And I wonder if their battle for sexual dignity, which was a battle for them for the very survival of their whole being, is actually our best chance for liberation. So in that way, young people who are on the forefront of challenging gender norms and sexuality norms are potentially our salvation. How many of you have watched Queer Eye, the new show? Queer Eye, a couple of people. Yeah. I resisted at first. My family encouraged me to watch it. They thought I could get some hints about my personal grooming and dress. But they mainly wanted me to see how much this show, I know it's mundane, but to a degree it's really teaching a new way of viewing the world. There are 5 norm-busting people, Antonio, Jonathan, Bobby, Tan, Caramo, and they help liberate people from bad habits and from poor self-esteem. Average Joe, so to speak, are sort of worked with these 5 that get them to dress better, to groom better, to make their living spaces cheerier and brighter, so that they can live happier and healthier lives. And my initial resistance to the program was because I felt like it was taking advantage of stereotypes. And maybe it is. But it also shows how straight and gay folk can work together to support each other and to share insecurities and feelings. I found out just this past week it's not scripted. Yes, which is very different than a lot of those reality shows. It's not just a celebration of LGBTQ progress in this country, but Harper's Bazaar. Middle America's Harper's Bazaar says it's, quote, an antidote to toxic masculinity. It's helping counter this hypermasculinity. One reviewer said it's a series about men trying to fix masculinity. Queer Eye deconstructs shame, marginalizes toxic masculinity, normalizes gender differences, and builds healthy relationships. The 5 hosts themselves have sort of made a family because some of their families have abandoned them. So they make their own family. The program I watched last week about Jess, a 23-year-old black queer lesbian who was thrown out of her home by her adoptive parents when she came out to them at 16, had to make her family up again. Or as one of them called it, their family. I love that, their family. Friends and family. So this caring encouragement and inclusive laughter is why many, many viewers get so much out of it. It is uplifting. It is joyous. And that's how I felt at that drag show in Scranton, Pennsylvania. Drag performances are often the target of stereotyping in film, like in La Cage aux Folles, but they also channel self-expression and joy for those who feel few opportunities to do that in this world. The situation for non-normative folk is improving, as I said. Individuals are able to grow beyond their stereotypes and into their whole selves. My friend Corey Walker, a.k.a. Cookie Diorio, speaks about his drag performances this way. He says, "When I am in drag, the gender-normative behaviors and ideals that I have been bumping my head on for as long as I can remember completely disappear. The more I drag, the more they lessen. It almost feels like I'm slowly moving from a place of internal imbalance to equilibrium. This definitely sparks peace and joy in me." And as I said, there's a lot I don't know about non-normative cultures around sexuality, and I thank my teachers, like my eldest son, Sean, who explained to me that burlesque is explicitly sexual and drag shows don't have to be. Or another friend who told me that not all drag shows are joyous, but some are of the torch song variety, full of sentimental songs about lost and unrequited love. But most all agree that the performers are affirmed and celebrated for a part of their identity that they've had to hide for too long. My son put it this way: the drag shows help reclaim things that have been shamed away. And this summer, you're going to have an opportunity to experience a bit of these at the Ethical Society. Corey's going to come back, organizing 3 musical programs to raise funds for groups that serve marginalized communities in Philadelphia. These shows, which I have the dates of so you can mark them on your calendar, are June 16th on gender identity, July 21st on gender equality, and August 18th on gender expression. Christian Hayden will be organizing follow-up discussions about a week after all 3 concerts. And I hope some of you come and bring your friends, because we need to change how we talk about this. Further dialogue can help deconstruct toxic shame and nurture joy. And I think that's one way to truly honor the inherent worth of every person. I'm going to leave you with the words of Brene Brown, who's helped millions of people dial down the shame and dial up the joy. Time is growing short. There are unexplored adventures ahead of you. You can't live the rest of your life worried about what other people think. You were born worthy of love and belonging. Courage and daring are coursing through you. You were made to live and to love with your whole heart. It's time to show up and be seen. Thank you.